Hello, everyone, and welcome to This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyun Park from Amalgam Insights, coming to you from Boston, actually, this time around, and I'm here with Charlie Araujo. How are you today?
I'm good. You're in my neck of the woods, just up the corridor a little bit. So good to have you on the East Coast. And I'm, as usual, you think I'd learned by now. I was took a couple of days for family time with my in-laws, my wife's family, and of course that means I'm just super far behind in everything now. It's like vacations are just never worth it.
No, they don't. They are not worth it. It just gives you more work to do when you come back. Yeah, more late nights.
But interesting. Where in fact, I think this is going to be a quick hit show. We're going to try to cover a lot of ground very quickly because we can tell that the unofficial end of summer has come because we had quite a bit of stuff out there this time to kind of go through, and so we've got a lot to cover. So let's dive in.
Yeah, like the first thing, top thing that I noticed this week was that, interestingly enough, in the AI space. So we remember the OpenAI debacle where they tried to kick out Sam Altman. There was this big coup. The board tried to change the CEO, and CEO counter couped back and basically kicked out the entire board. The
Is that a term? Counter cooed? I don't think I've ever heard that.
Yeah. Central to that was Ilya Sutskever, who was the CTO at OpenAI. And for a while, people were wondering, well, what's this guy going to do next? So he ended up starting a new AI company of his own called Safe Superintelligence. Kind of a weird name, but I'll let that go for right now. And this SSI just raised $1 billion to start new AI capabilities. And some of these firms involved in the funding are some of Silicon Valley's finest, Andreessen Horowitz, Sequoia Capital, as well as DST Global. So a lot of money that's going into a new player coming into the AI space. 10 people for now, but obviously with that amount of money, they're probably going to be hiring just a little bit.
Well, talk about they should have named the company Phoenix something, right? I mean, rising from the ashes, because everyone was pretty clear with that. I mean, it was this very sort of momentous sort of thing, right? The counter coup, as you called it, where he got ousted instead with a few other folks, and I don't know that he was counted out. I think I expected he was going to go back to academia, because the entire thing, and this actually leads to my not a concern, but my observation around this. The whole premise, which I agreed with, by the way, with that his statement was is that OpenAI was founded on this idea of doing research not being for profit, and that they had lost sight of that. And so that's really what was underlying all of this. And at least true to his word on this, what he's attempting to do with this is anchored in that same idea of what he's calling safe superintelligence. What I find suspect, though, or maybe not suspect because I don't think it's nefarious, but like has my head scratching a bit, is that when you take $1 billion of investors' money, not only do they want it back, but they want a return. And I don't, and yet he's talking, at least in this article, about not rushing to product, not
Right.
doing any of those things. And while I do think that some of these investors play long ball, I happen to believe we are 20 years from anything what we would truly call AGI. And so I really question if we're not just seeing, OpenAI version 2 with this, but I guess we'll see. I am personally happy to see a organization sort of taking up the reins of what OpenAI was originally founded for, but I just struggle to see how you take $1 billion of investor money and how that play out.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because I think Safe Superintelligence is setting up itself to be a competitor to Anthropic, which also talks about its more ethical AI perspective, and where Dario Amodei, has his OpenAI background as well. So we're seeing this competition to see who can be more ethical or perhaps more structured in their AI capabilities. But I agree, it's very hard to imagine that this won't lead to productization in the near future because if nothing else, venture capital firms work on this 10-year window at best. They have these funds where literally they're supposed to pay back their funds to investors in 10 years. So there is a time limit. And then when you look at DST Global, they tend to be a late stage investor, meaning their timeframes tend to be even more accelerated than that. So basically, all these funds are counting on Ilya and team being able to create something monetizable over the next 2 to 3 years, probably. Even if the next 2 to 3 years are mostly real R&D, there has to be something that is going to be monetizable. And when I think about either later stage fundraises or large fundraises, when you're talking about something like $1 billion, even $100 million, usually that amount of funding, it needs to turn into annual recurring revenue within at some point. If you're not getting to $1 billion in revenue in 5 years, this is a failed investment at the end of the day.
And I think what's difficult is it's very clear that it's going to take a lot of money to make all of this kind of technology work. And if they really could come up with AGI in that sort of time frame, I think the rewards would be significant. But this is not a space that's standing still. I mean, so continuing on our kind of fast hit, Anthropic, also made news, be introducing what they're calling Claude for Enterprise. And so we can fully expect that OpenAI and Anthropic and others are going to continue to be charging ahead. So while they're doing this hardcore R&D for the next 3 years, the market's going to be moving at this incredibly rapid pace. And I do think that's going to create an immense amount of pressure around that. So we'll see where that goes. Going on to the Anthropic announcement, I thought it was interesting. I mean, they previewed this, so we knew it was coming. But solid, I think, because I actually am a big fan. I mean, I probably should be using the Claude more in my daily model use, because I am a fan of the way Anthropic approaches everything. I think if I sort of look at these three, OpenAI, SSI now on the other end of the spectrum, you find Anthropic sort of right in the middle, right? Trying to take these very pragmatic, safe oriented, community oriented sort of approaches, but also delivering stuff into the market that is usable. And so I appreciate that they're approaching this. Their big thing is really two things: enterprise grade control or security, fine grained permissioning, all of that sort of stuff that an enterprise needs around this. And then features, although the features really come down to, I mean, first of all, they've already introduced some features in the past, their notebook, that I think are already enterprise oriented. And now what they've really done is expand the context window to 500K, which is massive. And really allows, when we think of things like RAG and other ways to augment, where you end up ingesting a massive amount of data to try to make sense of it, really opens the door to doing some pretty amazing things. The part I still remain skeptical, and this applies to all of these, is I'm becoming more and more convinced that the future for AI in the enterprise is embedded, meaning it's not these chat windows just sitting out there doing its thing. And so I think that creates a challenge for all of this class of player. But I still think it's a really interesting move and a really smart move on their part. So, I mean, what was your take on it?
Yeah, I agree 100% on that last bit, that although AI and business intelligence and analytics are not directly comparable in a bunch of different ways, one way in that they are similar is that embedded BI and embedded AI are both going to be key to making these work. We saw that in the BI market, where until you were really able to embed it into apps, a lot of the money just wasn't there. This is going to be a very similar story for AI, where the story around embedded AI, around API pricing, around being able to have an AI store or some way or having different ways to be able to monetize your AI efforts at the end of the day. Those are going to be important. And that was the part that wasn't quite baked from this Claude for Enterprise launch. If it's truly for enterprise, if it is truly supposed to be part of a B2B market, you need all those other pieces in place to be rock solid and really there from a monetizable and operational perspective.
Yeah, although and I mean, in their defense, I suppose both they and OpenAI and presumably SSI, when they get there, are sort of, I don't want to say they're between a rock and a hard spot. They chose this space, but they're trying to be in the foundation business, sort of like the AWSs of cloud, right? All right, where it's like, I'm providing the infrastructure, I'm providing the core, and then you you, the community, are then doing something with it. And so clearly, both Anthropic and OpenAI have this API-based model, which is really meant to be the way that that happens, right? So they're
Mhm.
not competing. But I think as we've seen with both Amazon and Microsoft, um, there's probably a limit to that, right? Where I fully expect that we're going to start seeing these folks develop these more enterprise grade integrated apps in a way that actually makes them more functional, because otherwise you're just dropping a chatbot, and it's there's just so much slack in that in terms of how you might apply it, that it's tough to make sense of it, and tough to real I mean, even Microsoft, which I think is doing a better job of embedding it, is struggling making the case for why someone should pay $30 a user per month to just get this chatbot, right? And yet, where we are seeing are companies that are embedding it deeply into workflows, deeply into the process of an organization. You're able to extract so much more value because you're not leaving it up to the user to sort of figure it out. And so I think it's an interesting. I think this is smart. I think it's a good move, but I also think it's, maybe not enough. Um, Speaking of the same lines, though, and I'm curious on this one too, your take.
Mhm.
OpenAI, I guess they made a press release, but in either case, I guess they've announced that they now have 1 million paid, and this is the key, business users.
Mhm.
So also trying to make the case that they are going after the enterprise, and this is a 400, almost 100% increase, about an 80% increase since April. So what is that? May,
Mhm.
June, July, August, like 4 or 5 months. That's significant. What I think is most interesting about this, and I would love to see better data on exactly what this looks like. Is this just individual users that have business email addresses, or because they have not done nearly the same effort, I think, on the enterprise play, right? They've mostly been using
Mhm.
like Microsoft and others to focus on the enterprise. So this one, while interesting and certainly a sign of strength, also left me scratching my head a little bit, going, is it real?
Right. OpenAI has definitely been selling into the enterprise and they want the business users, but do they have the same level of that control plane that you expect from your enterprise applications? It's not quite there in the same way. And this reminds me of a couple of things that we've talked about recently, both Salesforce attacking Microsoft for just having the $30 Copilot and not quite being able to provide the business results you're looking for. Frankly, OpenAI and ChatGPT fall into the same boat with their $20 amount per month offering, which is fantastic as an entry point, but doesn't necessarily get you to actual business value at the end of the day. But also, it's interesting that OpenAI in the same story was being rumored to consider higher price points for better models, including going up to possibly $2,000 a year, when we've seen from the likes of the cloud hyperscalers that honestly, the cost story is kind of a race to the bottom if you are really looking for adoption. Amazon Web Services, I would say to their credit, rarely raises prices. They can't do it in this competitive market if they want to gain market share, and they know that. So usually they will price cut over time as they have additional services. And the idea of being able to raise prices, especially 10x, like OpenAI is talking about, usually is not a great step forward for enterprise markets unless you have some sort of extreme competitive advantage, such as, say, Oracle database had back in the day when it was really the only game in town, or when Oracle and SAP first came out as ERPs and had that kind of price control. But I don't think OpenAI really has that as a model company, to be honest.
Yeah, well, and the article is not at all clear on what that means. Is that, are these special use cases where this is some API that's not representing a single user? I mean, if they're talking a single user, then it needs to be a killer
Mm-hmm.
use case to make any sense. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting sort of space to see how this all develops, especially given. So I didn't bring this article up. I thought we'd save it for next week because this was literally came out right as we were prepping for this call.
Mm-hmm.
But um, there's another article on the Wall Street Journal about how big these bets are getting and how much return you have to get out of them to see it. And it certainly makes what it's pointing to is the fact that there is so much reticence on that part of enterprise IT organizations to figure out what's that path, right? That's why we talked a few weeks ago about Microsoft running into some roadblocks within the CIO world, and because of that. And so I think that this is one of those classic cases of a technology looking for a problem to solve. Thankfully, I think there's lots of problems that this technology can solve, but it's a matter of now how do you put it together and actually make sense of it. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out. And speaking of Salesforce, we've been talking a lot about them lately, mostly because I think they need to start thinking about changing their name because
Mhm.
they seem to increasingly become less and less of a CRM company and less of even a business app company, and increasingly becoming a data company.
Their data
And
force. Yes.
they, yeah, and they double down on that again this week with the acquisition of a company whose name I can't stand, Own Company. It's just hard to say, for $1.9 billion. And what's interesting again is that they are fundamentally a data protection and data management company. Again, really sort of creating a very clear signal as to the direction, I think, anyway, that Salesforce is going.
Yeah, the Own Company, again, yeah, awful name. Their their big product is continuous data protection, basically using change data capture capabilities to be able to understand any change happening at the data at any time. So you're not just taking hourly backups or even 15-minute backups. You literally get that change happening as it happens. So you basically have a time machine for any point in time for your Salesforce deployments. And they do have some other stuff as well. But for our own company, Salesforce really was the majority of the revenue. So Salesforce basically said, hey, this time machine capability is pretty cool and it's differentiated compared to, frankly, all the other companies that also do Salesforce backups, because obviously there are other companies that have been doing this over the past 2 decades. But this ability to be able to say, we have this time time-based way of looking at the data is possibly also useful from a machine learning and AI perspective, because now you have this way of being able to go back in time and being able to look at all of these trends that are happening in your data, all these changes that are happening, they're all being captured. So now you can do AI stuff based on that. And so I think this is going to be a really interesting acquisition at the end of the day, because it lets Salesforce do a little bit more work with the changes in data that happen. And it doesn't hurt that Own Company has a former Salesforce product person who was in charge of Own Company and obviously is coming back into the fold. They thought they had escaped, but Salesforce brought him back.
I think what is interesting about this from a couple of perspectives. First of all, I agree with you. I think that the data element of it and feeding into the future growth of AI, and machine learning models is interesting. But what this also speaks to, and this is something that I think we've hit on a few times, but it's easy to get lost. I mean, I joke that we should be called This Week in Enterprise AI because it's like that's all we end up talking about. It feels like. But this is just a reminder that most of the world of enterprise IT is blocking and tackling. It's dealing with the day-to-day activities of just keeping things running and moving. And part of my frustration with all the talk around AI is how difficult it is for most enterprise IT organizations to operationalize it when we are still struggling with just so many of the kind of basic things like data backup and data continuity. And so this is an example of Salesforce, I think, smartly saying, "Hey, this is a place that the more we can bring this integrated approach to it together makes a lot of sense." And going back to what I was just talking about, where I think the future challenges for the Anthropic and the OpenAIs is that Salesforce is in a perfect position if they, kind of like the whole thing that we talked about last week still doesn't make quite sense to me. But if they get their head on straight around how they're approaching AI and really go down this road, like they had that research that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, um, they're in the position where suddenly AI just becomes infused into all these other application layers that they already have that people are using on a day-to-day basis. And clearly Salesforce is already going that direction, right? And
Mhm.
if they can completely execute on that, that becomes a real threat, because at some point, from my standpoint, you sit and say, why am I going to be wasting my time trying to figure out how to bring in an Anthropic or an OpenAI or an SSI into the fold when somebody who is already one of my primary systems of record or multiple potentially systems of record, and it's being baked into everything I'm doing, and it has all these other layers of data management and all the stuff that I need to make AI work. sort of baked into it, I think that becomes the fight. And I think that we're going to see more and more of this sort of which way do we go play out. And I think that the only thing right now that is saving the OpenAIs and the Anthropics of the world is it takes so much money to go down that road today that it's
Mhm.
difficult for a company, like, well, anyone. I mean, I think Salesforce is there where they can invest in it, but almost anybody else cannot. And that's the thing that's that barrier that is protecting the current AI players. But I think that the world is going to be coming down to it's the blocking and tackling and the infusion of AI, and that bodes well for a way the game that Salesforce is playing.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting though that AI has become so expensive that either you need to raise $1 billion or you literally need to be Salesforce or Microsoft, one of these companies that is used to spending, call it 20 or $30 billion in an acquisition, and now they've basically pushed that money into AI instead for the past couple of years. That honestly where the money's coming from. Salesforce isn't buying another Slack or Tableau or MuleSoft right now. They are literally pouring that money back into AI, and that's the resources that it takes to be a real player here. Yeah, absolutely.
And then we have the other end of the spectrum, and the news that I chuckled when you sent it over and I read it, that AT&T is suing Broadcom over the VMware support stuff. We talked about this when this acquisition took place, whatever it was, I guess 4 or 5 months ago now.
Mhm.
And we talked then about that they were just becoming a cash cow. And what the reason I bring it up, I find the juxtaposition so wildly different, right? You have companies like Salesforce and all these ones that we've been talking about making these massive investments into the future and just taking big swings. And then you have this play, right? And this is the other end of the world of IT that we live in, where this is a cash cow and they are just trying to wring everything they can out of it. And I, for one, am sort of glad to hear AT&T, another big company, with the wherewithal to go and kind of push back on this. And I'm sure there's thousands of smaller companies who don't have the ability to go fight someone like Broadcom cheering from the sideline, please go fight this battle for us. I mean, it's just crazy.
Yeah, AT&T basically said straight out, we had this deal, and you said when we renewed in 2024, we could continue doing our service the way we wanted it for another 2 years. And then Broadcom said, "Oh, sorry, we bought the company, and now we're going to totally change the rules." And AT&T said, "Hey, not so fast." And this is important both because obviously there's AT&T's piece of the puzzle where they're saying we honestly can't move off of VMware for several years, even if we wanted to, because we're a very slow monolithic telecom, but also because a lot of smaller companies end up using large vendors, large client contracts as a template for their own contracts when they're able to get access to them, either by working in consortiums or being able to work as partners in some way. So AT&T might be able to set some sort of precedent for these smaller companies as well, who also might have said, "Hey, we thought we were going to get this certain type of contract for the or certain type of support for the next 1, 2, 3 years. We agreed to it back in 2022 with the old administration and old leadership that was in place. And you have to actually respect that, even though you've changed everything else around your partner structure and you got rid of thousands of SKUs and changed them to basically 4 bundles that we can buy. Sometimes that increased our pricing by 200 to 400% by giving us the moon and sun and the stars into a bundle when we just wanted 1 star.
It's going to be interesting to see. I mean, obviously, for those of us that follow this like inside baseball, we've all been aware of this, but the general public, I don't think, has been. And this lawsuit is going to elevate this into, they're going to be talking about it on CNBC and all of that. And I'm curious if that actually changes Broadcom's approach and posture. I kind of doubt it. I mean, they certainly seem to be combative in arguing this point publicly, at least right now.
Mhm.
So I doubt it's going to change it. But I mean, I struggle. Well, it to me, it highlights 2 points, right? One is I sit here and say there is an entire class of companies that this is their approach, where they're genuinely not trying to innovate anything. They're just, going out there and sort of milking. But it also speaks to the point I was talking about, which is how much of the blocking and tackling. I mean, AT&T, while they may be older, bigger, slower, and more monolithic than the average enterprise, they're probably more representative of the average enterprise than not, in that so many organizations have so much investment in this technology and they can't just undo it. And so
Yes.
that's what, made this, I guess, smart in the, not great way smart, in the case of Broadcom of the acquisition, because they knew they had this runway, and they've clearly tried to take advantage of it. I struggle just because, as a true believer of technology and the power of technology, I want to see innovation. I don't want to see people just, going and doing that. And so in that way, it's disappointing, but it is what it is. Speaking of disappointing and older monolithic type companies, SAP has, and we don't want to spend a lot of time on this particular news, but yet another senior exec at SAP is out, although this time for a completely different reason, and that we know very little about. All we know is that he's bowed out over an incident at a company shindig, as they're calling it, at some kind of a party or a company event. And it was inappropriate behavior, but we don't know what it is. And it seems to be there's just been a lot of this sort of bad behavior by execs across the industry lately, and it's unfortunate. But I'm curious your take. We probably wouldn't even be talking about this except for the fact that SAP had two senior execs
Yes.
leave, not
Mhm.
under bad circumstances like this, but leave. So this is like almost a gutting of the executive team.
Right. The fact that their CTO, Jürgen Mueller, ended up having some ethical incident, that's not the part I want to dig into here. Although obviously, like, don't do reprehensible, unethical behavior on the job. Like, I don't know how else to say that. Like, please don't do that. Um, more important part that from a practical and work perspective right now is that it looks like Christian Klein, the SAP CEO, will be taking over a lot of the responsibilities that he had. Now, we talked just a few weeks ago about how their chief revenue officer had also left and their chief marketing officer was leaving. And this seems like a lot of responsibility for the CEO to be taking on all at once because SAP is not a small company. Each one of these roles is a very real role. The sales role is a big standalone role. The CTO role is a big standalone role. And you have to, SAP has always been good at understanding succession planning, but right now this seems to be an exception. There don't seem to be those backups in place to pick up the pieces quickly right now. So if I were an SAP customer right now, I would be asking who's in charge and what's going to be happening with the roadmap for the foreseeable future with both the CTO and CRO roles currently in flux.
And it comes at, I think, a difficult time for them. While I do not by any stretch put them in the same category as like a Broadcom, they are an older technology company that, to their credit, have been trying to innovate, but to their detriment, have been struggling with it, have been struggling to really execute. And so I think that they were right in the enmeshed in this whole trying to move, getting caught up on the cloud space, and then AI hits, and SAP is a big company, and we are never talking about them in the context of any AI investments or really anything moving forward as far as helping lead the industry on the AI perspective. And there are companies like Era out there that are very AI centric and very focused on a lot of the areas sort of around the edges of where SAP is playing, and they're being threatened across every sector really. And so I think that this is definitely bad timing for them, and we'll have to see how that plays out as all this develops. Um, so I think it's interesting too, because the world, as we look at these big companies, is all sort of adjusting and trying to figure out what to make of all of it. And we saw evidence of that this week with NVIDIA triggering a stock market freakout in the absolute most bizarre way possible by hitting their numbers,
Yes.
but not blowing them out the window like they are out, blowing the doors off of the numbers like they had been doing in the past. And that was enough to create this sell-off. And so there was this article in Vox talking about like, what does this mean to the market? And I found it almost bordering on ridiculous, because one company should not have this much effect on the stock market, on the economy as a whole. And I think it speaks to just, whether we're in an AI bubble or not, just to how many eggs we are putting our collective eggs in this AI basket. And so I know what your thought on this whole episode was.
So this is going to be pretty random, but one of my favorite cartoons on the Cartoon Network, there's this uh, cartoon called Metalocalypse, and it was about a band that had basically become the most powerful economic force in the world. And every time the drummer moved a pinky or the lead singer missang a word in a gig, it would completely tank the entire economy. And that's where I feel like we're at right now. It's like NVIDIA, the moment that Jensen Huang says and instead of if, or extends a word half a second too long in a press release, suddenly things are collapsing, and it's really hard to tell why. There are a few things we do know about the company. There is a centralization of revenue where basically 4 companies are spending 40 to 50%, are making up 40 to 50% of the revenue. And that is very top heavy and very risky in theory. But we also know that for the next 2 or 3 years, these spend patterns are probably going to continue. It's hard to see that not happening. And I feel like anybody that's freaking out about any announcements being made right now is just really touchy, frankly. There's nothing unexpected or unpredictable about anything that NVIDIA is saying right now to a reasonable human being.
What I think is interesting, and something that's what the article points out, and I think it's really what this is that NVIDIA is increasingly becoming a barometer for the entire AI sector.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a whole bunch of people who, particularly in the stock market, right, or the investor community, that just don't understand any of this technology. They have no idea what any of this really means. And all they know is NVIDIA was producing, they'd set expectations at X and they were doing 2 and 3X. And now suddenly it's not. And they go, oh no, that must mean that everything is bad. It's like this proxy thing. And I think that's really the challenge, because there is so much unknown about this, and particularly outside. I mean, even in tech, most people, I mean, I talk to people in tech all the time who really don't have a clue how all this technology is working. I mean, I barely understand it, right? And so you now multiply that out, and I think that's what you're seeing happening. And I think it is a point of concern, at least insofar as we've talked about. We know we're at the beginning of this. We know this is a very long road. There's going to be lots of ups and downs. We're going to go through the trough of disillusionment. We may already be in it, and so the potential for these wild swings, I think, are potentially challenging. And speaking of that, we're seeing a couple of emerging elements here that I think are interesting, because that kind of make this point. So one of it is a Wall Street Journal article talking about virtual reality, VR headsets, which alternatively more recently has been broadly referred to as the metaverse, which is AR, VR altogether, and that suddenly we're having uses of virtual reality, and not surprisingly, in the realm of training, employee training mostly, that it can be much less expensive, or much more cost effective, and much more effective in its action with training functions. And I love this because I've remained bullish on the metaverse really since we started talking about it. AI came and sucked all the air out of the room, and Meta, which literally changed its name to go and invest in this, had to all but abandon talking about it. But I still believe there's a huge amount of play here, particularly from an enterprise perspective. And so it just is a simple reminder that we've been talking about AR and VR for 20 plus years now. And we sort of have gone through these cycles, and it gets all hyped up, and then it crashes, and then it sort of comes back. And for me, the big takeaway was almost this object lesson in, hey, we're going to see this with AI as well.
Yeah, but I do think that these might actually work hand in hand, because one of the challenges around virtual reality has simply been that the technology hasn't been up to the use cases. Either you have to wear a clunky headset, or it's not multisensory enough to imitate reality, so you get dizzy from your inner ear, or there are things that you expect from a touch or maybe the smell or taste perspective if it's a consumer use case, that don't really work out. And I think we're getting closer to being able to replicate some of these things through AI, where either generative AI or specific sensors are able to provide some of that feedback. But yes, VR has been useful and AR have been useful from a training perspective. My former colleague Todd Maddox did some fantastic research on how being able to be trained with this extended reality went directly to your amygdala and was able to create some lessons for your brain that would come in from multiple angles to be able to really help you learn something in a way that just doesn't happen when you're watching a video or when you are reading a piece of text. So there's definitely a future here once the technology catches up. But I feel like we've been trying to catch up because we've been getting closer and closer to real reality for a while. I think going back to the Cisco telepresence days when you bought a room for $500,000 and it was going to give you a life-size view of video, as ridiculous as the price point was, I feel like that was at least a start to acknowledging the actual technologies that were needed to start making VR and AR real. And we're still getting there. But yes, there will be a market. We just have to get there.
I agree, and I think and I think you're right. That's the other big lesson is these technologies playing each other. I think one of the big hiccups, particularly one of the use cases is like HR training. And one of the big hiccups was it's like the best I could do is record videos and try to use some clunky technology to play the right video based on your answer. Well, now I've got generative AI that if I use it properly, it can potentially actually create a true role playing type environment where I can see the consequences of those actions if I've trained a model appropriately. So, I mean, to me, the big lesson here isn't, that you should go invest in VR, although I think you should be looking at it. I think it's a great technology that has a place. But it's really about this is the ebb and flow of technology cycles, and we can't lose sight of that despite all the AI hype. Um, anyway, so we're almost out of time. We like to always finish on a fun note, but we don't have one this week. So what we have is a very unfun one, and that is recent news that the IT unemployment rate. This is also from a Wall Street Journal article. Has hit 6%, despite there being overall U.S. job growth, and this is, of course, counter to what we have historically seen, where IT was always the big strong part. Now, I took issue with this article a little bit, and maybe my perspective is wrong on this, but I always draw a distinction between the tech sector and IT. And for me, IT are those people that work in enterprise IT functions, delivering the technology within an organization. The tech sector are those that deliver technology to consumers of that technology. And this report where this number is combining both of those. So it included in that are big cuts by Cisco and AT&T and others. But it also speaks to some softening in what I would consider the traditional IT market, basically pointing to anyone who's not in AI, anyone whose job is to run these backend systems. And it speaks to something that we have talked about for CIOs, this continuing pressure on organizations not wanting to invest in just the keeping the lights on sort of technology. And so I think that represents I think we just need to be aware of it and recognize that this is our reality. It's the continuing reality, and we need to see where that's going to play out in terms of where investments then are going to be made.
Yes, and I also think it speaks to the importance of hybrid IT and the death of monolithic IT. If you are a specialist in, sorry to pick on you again, SAP or Oracle, and you made a 20-year career out of administering the platform, this is probably not a safe time for you and your IT job, to be quite frank. If you had one of those Cisco certifications that used to be gold when I started my career, again, it is much easier to outsource networking management capabilities either to a consulting firm or to push some of these capabilities into the cloud at this point. That's just the reality of where we are right now. And so we're moving to best in breed technologies across the board, probably with some sort of distributed control plane or control layer. And as long as you're willing to move with that and keep in touch with the technologies rather than be wedded to a specific vendor, you'll be okay. But there's definitely the need at this point to understand how the cloud works in conjunction with on-prem capabilities, and to look at this AI world for real, because training for data, understanding how data is transferred from one place to another, understanding the inputs and outputs, and embedding and the ongoing operationalization of AI in context of your network or data center or any other IT job is going to be an important one. That's where we're going, and traditional IT is not the place to be hoping for your next 20 years of IT career.
And I think that's true. Even, we had love to pick on the SAPs and Oracles of the world, but I think that's increasingly true if you are a Salesforce administrator or a ServiceNow developer, right? I think that the entire time of this is I pick this one vendor and I make my career out of it. We have to be focused on the business problems, on the use cases, the workflows that are driving that, the underlying data architecture, and I mean, if you're in we talked about Salesforce earlier today and that they're becoming much more of a data company. I think that's a great model, right? You're not a CRM administrator anymore. You need to be focused on this entire life cycle of the data that is helping drive the business. And the more that you're doing that, I think the better off you're going to be. So not fun news, but it also, I think, a signal as to where things are developing and heading into.
Absolutely. On that note, please invest in yourselves and don't be part of that 6% getting unemployed. If you are part of that 6%, good luck to you. The jobs will come back. The jobs are there, but you need to adjust yourself to where the jobs are just a little bit. And on that note, we're going to call it a week. Thank you so much for joining us and for joining our opinions on all these quick hits. As always, we love hearing from you. Please email us, comment, like, subscribe, and let us know what you're thinking about this week so we can contextualize it next week. Take care.